Body, nice to see you. Beverly, what I'm thinking about is that when we were in Binghamton, one of the graduate students called her dog Crisis. And then,
I don't remember
and then,
that.
and then I imagined the dog getting loose in a crowded street and she would be shouting through the street. I don't know whether I ever heard it. Crisis, crisis. And this was world system studies, and Emmanuel was more on the crisis line. André Gunder Frank also did a book on crisis. Giovanni was more on the hegemony line in combination with other things. And Beverly, you combine this with your work on labor and interest in social movements. So you're making a new combination, which is a very well. It brings in a lot of people joining us, of course. So. Beverly Silver, Johns Hopkins University, Giovanni Arrighi Center, a warm welcome to you. Nice to see you. Nice to see everyone. Please let us welcome Beverly.
Thank you
Please.
very much. Should I begin?
Yes, please. Beverly, over
Okay.
to you. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody for taking the time to come and participate in this colloquium. I decided to organize the presentation as a life history of two research projects, two major collective research projects that I've been involved in since the mid-1980s, since my days at the Fernand Braudel Center in Binghamton. The first one is the World Labor Group project, which dates back to the mid-80s. And the second is one that we began about, I'd say 2011, 2012, certainly by 2015, which is this global social protest research working group project that we began at the Arrighi Center. And they're both, I just wanted to say from the outset that the work I'm going to present is the result of collective research projects. And so I wanted to acknowledge my collaborators over these decades, and for this most recent project, particularly Sahan Karatasli, who was a PhD student when we started and is now an assistant professor at University of North Carolina, Greensboro, but many people participated. I can't start. So let me start with, let's see. Oh, come on. I'm not really normally this incompetent on the technology, but so the origin of the first project, the World Labor Group project in the 1980s and 90s was, this period where there was a general idea of a universal and terminal crisis of labor movements, particularly when we started in the 80s. Of course, the United States labor movement was already in deep crisis with givebacks. The UK labor movement was under assault from Margaret Thatcher. Italy, which had just had a major successful mass labor movement in the 69, 70, in the 70s, the so-called Autunno Caldo in 1969, was also, like by 1980, had suffered a major defeat. So there was a general sentiment going around that whether it was deindustrialization or capital mobility, globalization, automation, that a terminal crisis of labor movements was in the offing. And our thesis was that this obituary of labor movements was based on a core-centric and somewhat ahistorical perspective, and that if we take widen the geographical perspective, so we're in the Department of Global Studies, so global studies. So if we take a global perspective and a longer term historical perspective, that things start to look different. And in particular, if we work from a theory of historical capitalism as, whether using Schumpeter's language of creative destruction or Marx's all that's solid melts into air, that what when we're thinking about labor movements, or when we're thinking about any processes of capitalism more generally, or social conflict or social unrest, we have to think about a process, a system that's constantly undergoing transformation. And then as far as what it means for working classes and labor movements, there's a continuous making, unmaking, and remaking of working classes on a global scale, both in terms of geographical location, industrial location, et cetera. And I'll get more into this. So when we started this project in the 1980s, our thought was that these defeats in the core of labor movements, which were clearly there, were not the end of history, and so not the end of labor movement history, but an end of a phase of history in which the industrial working class in the core was the vanguard of the labor movements globally. And now I'm going to fight with the cursor. Sorry, folks. I'm sure there's another way to do this. So our argument was instead that that the geographical mobility of capital, what Harvey would call a spatial fix, or what called a spatial fix to the problems of profitability and labor control, was leading to new working class formation and the emergence of strong labor movements in sites of rapid industrialization. So again, when we were starting this original project, we were saying, yes, there's a crisis of labor movements in the core, but there's this emergence of strong new working classes in areas that were industrializing rapidly, like Brazil, South Africa, South Korea. These are the photos I have here. I could put other photos, like Poland in its own way is very much a case. So again, like thinking, making the global studies methodological point explicit, we're working from an idea that, like dependency, where it sees development and underdevelopment as two sides of the same global process, we were seeing the weakening and strengthening of labor movements as two sides of one global process as an outcome of the general geographical and other reorganization of capitalism. So I've got to keep this cursor in the same place so I don't have a problem. Yeah. So the 80s, with this in mind, right? With this idea in mind, we began a data collection project called the World Labor Group Data Collection. And we were motivated by the idea, again, another global studies point, that one of the problems we have in looking at capitalism as a global historical and global system is we don't have appropriate data. That data is short term, that data is national level, that there's a tendency to generalize from a couple of core countries to the world, and that this was a problem. And so we set out to try and create a data set that was both at least more than a century in scope, that covered the entire long 20th century, and that also allowed us to look at these kind of interlinks between labor movements, both direct linkages of solidarity, which are a little easier to study, and then these kind of indirect linkages behind the backs, where labor movements are not consciously linked, but are nevertheless, their fates are linked by processes of capital accumulation on a global scale. So we determined to write down every report of labor unrest everywhere in the world from 2 newspapers from 1870 to the present. We use the international reporting of the New York Times and the London Times. And it took us, I can't remember, I'd have to go back and reconstruct how long it took us to do the first data collection. The first one covered from 1870 to 1985 or whatever. And this was still back in the days where, like, if you had, there was like 87,000 articles or that we had written down, the country, the year, whether it was a strike or not a strike, other form of unrest, the industry. So, but this was back in the days, early PC days, and you would put the data into the computer, go home, have a good night's sleep, come back, and the data would be sorted and you could do a time series. So here was the first time series that we got. And this is published in chapter 4 of Forces of Labor. Some people may be familiar with it, but the reason I'm showing it is because in the life history of the project, we went, oh, because we weren't actually looking for this when we started the project. We were looking to try and then disaggregate down to the national and industry level and kind of follow capital mobility from this place to that place and see if we got new working class formation and new labor movements. And so it was this thing that I was talking about initially at the outset that was what motivated us to start the project. But then we looked at this and we said, oh, what the first thing that jumped out was that, the two peaks, this is the number, just to say what this is, it's the number of reports in international reports of labor unrest in the New York Times and the London Times everywhere in the world from 1870 to 1996. And what came out was that 1919 and 1947 were the global historical peaks for this period. And so we said, well, after a moment of like going, oh, we also said, that in a way this wasn't surprising, that there's a long tradition within the social science literature making the link between wars and revolution and wars and major social upheavals, and especially lost wars and leading to revolutions. And in fact, there were kind of three sort of hypotheses out there in the literature about war and revolution that seem to all be supported by this data. And one was that, war leads to big explosions of labor unrest, 1919, 1914. The two peaks in the series are after the two world wars, that wars lead to social cohesion or a rallying around the flag effect. And in fact, the world wars are periods of troughs of labor unrest. And then the other is an interesting one, which is about wars. The motivation, rulers have a motivation to go to war during high periods of social conflict. And domestic social conflict is a way of externalizing and producing a rally around the flag effect. So to divert internal domestic conflict to external conflict. And so this is one thing. And the other thing that I'm going to come back to, as promised in the abstract, but is that we also began to think about the fact that, this period of rising unrest was actually was also a period of, of what we would later think about as a crisis of hegemony. So the second thing I wanted to point out on the original data collection that we did was this collapse, right? So, 78 is Thatcher, 89, of course, the post 89, you get another bump down. So whereas 1919, 1947 are big peaks, labor unrest globally remains high and then starts to hit, like go down in successive bumps down. 78, Thatcher, and then Reagan comes in, 89 to 91, fall of the Soviet Union. 94 is the takeoff of financialization. It's Clinton, right? It's the repeal of Glass-Steagall. On a global scale, it's really in many ways where neoliberalism in an extreme form begins to take off globally by 94. It's not just repeal of Glass-Steagall, but even in China, 94 is the year that layoffs from state-owned enterprises are legalized, and they begin to have massive layoffs from state-owned enterprises. You know, South Africa, 94 has first democratic elections, and by 97 is also following neoliberal policies in terms of let me just point to both this, you know, these early peaks and then this collapse, which after 98, you know, which when we went in and looked at the details, we would still see, you know, big wave in South Korea in 87, even though it's like a big wave happening in the context of a collapse, big wave in Brazil in the 80s, you know, et cetera. But okay. So, and this is just one thing that I'm, again, as part of the setup from the old project, is to bring in something noticeable here. And that is that there's a trough, two troughs that correspond to the periods of financialization, the period of financialization in the late 19th century and the period of financialization in the late 20th century, or UK led, you know, which are part of the transit hegemonic transitions. So, you know, so here we were in a trough in the late in the 90s and late 1990s, going into the early 21st century. And at the same time, you know, theoretically, we weren't thinking this is the end of history. You know, certainly not the end of labor movement history, not much less the end of all social movement and social conflict history. And so on the one hand, you know, there's something that I already alluded to, is where capital goes, conflict follows. So there was this eye out to see what was going to happen in China as industrial production and new working class formation was increasingly centered in China as a main center of industrialization and working class formation. And the second thing we're looking for was this idea that this disorganization of working classes that was tied in many ways to the period of financialization, that in the late 19th century it had been temporary and now it had been temporary, and in some ways that the financialization itself, while it was solving, was leading to a resurgence of profitability for capital, was also leading to growing inequality and a deepening crisis of legitimacy for capitalism. And so that brings us to this table, which I don't want to, I've actually finally published this. I've been like showing it forever, but I finally published it in a piece called Plunges into Utter Destruction and the Limits of Historical Capitalism, which is in a volume from one of the Carl Polanyi conferences. But somebody's mowing the lawn outside. The important thing that I wanted to say is that, you know, if we look at from the crisis of the late 60s, 70s to today, so these kind of crisis 3 and crisis 4, what we see is we're going from a period of a crisis that the main problem is it's a crisis of profitability for capitalism. So I say, you know, protection of fictitious commodities is like too high, right? To a crisis of legitimacy, where the protection of fictitious commodities, including labor, especially labor, is too low. So we're in the center of a deep crisis of legitimacy for capitalism, which should be leading us to, again, expect rising social protest. So, so I don't want to go, I mean, we can talk about this graph later. It sort of sums up a lot of things about how I think about the 20th century. And there's the, you know, the hegemonies, you know, it's the, from the signal crisis to the terminal crisis of British hegemony, and the signal crisis to the terminal crisis of US hegemony, which is builds in necessarily this pendulum swing between crisis of profitability and crisis of legitimacy. But every time I try to explain it in detail, you know, the time will just be gone. So in any case, we stopped the data collection in 1996 because that's interesting. I think, let me go back here, because, and you know, you can see we were, you know, in this horrible trough, and it was clear that the trough was, so it was like looking for a needle in the haystack, right? And I had, you know, graduate students who kept saying, oh, come on, let's, you know, restart the data, let's keep the data set going, let's update it. They were saying, you know, now that all by this time, you know, by about 10 years ago, you know, maybe even a bit more than 10 years ago, all of the newspapers were digitized online. So, historically back long periods, so we could do it as a, you know, we could take advantage of, you know, new technologies, right? And I said, well, something's going to happen, but let's you know, let's wait, you know, before we get started. So then, okay, so this is what happened. So in 2010, I was actually on an airplane flying from Seoul to Beijing, and I got a free copy of the Financial Times. And on the front page of the Financial Times, there was suddenly, the entire front page of the Financial Times was full of reports of labor unrest. And most strikingly, this big wave of strikes by auto workers and workers more generally in China. By 2011, you know, we had the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, and the Time magazine was calling the protester the person of the year. And so that's more or less, we said, okay, now it's time, right, to start the new project. And in 2015, we got the NSF grant, and by 2000, and we started, you know, we've been doing the data collection for a while now. I'm frustratingly slow for anybody working with me. So actually, you know, any normal person would have had lots of this out by now already, but I think we're getting close to getting it out and published. By 2019, you know, there were headlines like this one, you know, 2019, the story of 2019 protests in every corner of the globe. It was very, you know, like the pandemic kind of has erased 2019, but 2019, you know, prior to the pandemic, you know, the whole story was global social protest, this explosion of global social protest. So, so we started the new project, which relied on the digitized historical archives of the New York Times and the Guardian. I could talk, we used a search string to pull out articles that we thought would be on social unrest. Let me say that this project is a collection, an attempting to collect all the reports of all forms of social protests, not just labor unrest. And we, excuse me, and then this search string pulled out 500,000 articles, and then we started doing, collecting, you know, sorting out the true positives from the false positives, recording event details. And we did it randomly so, so that we could actually, at a certain point, the global picture, we're at a point where the global picture hasn't changed for a long time. Some of the national pictures are pretty stable too. We've, you know, done about a third, randomized coding of about a third of the 500,000 articles. And okay, so here's the first result. And again, this is global social, this is all forms of social protest. I'll also pull out and show just the labor unrest data. So, you know, the first thing to note is, yes, there has been an upsurge as measured by, you know, as can be seen from this this form of data collection, let's say this data set, and from, you know, based on the reports of international reports of social protest in the New York Times and the Guardian, by the way, excluding the US for New York Times and excluding the UK for the Guardian. So, and we also see kind of down where we left off, because the old data set left off in 1996. And in fact, you see this long kind of trough between in the 90s and first decade of the 21st century. So, and by the way, we're now working on updating this. The first round of data set collection we did ended in 2016, but we're now, you know, updating it to 2020. And when we add in the data from 2016 through 2017 to 2020, we can already tell it's going to be higher than what you're seeing right now in for the 2011, 2014. So it'll continue to go up in the last few years. Just similar kind of thing. This is the number of countries with reports of social protest, even one report of social protest. And then again, you see this upward turn, and then hinting back again to the comparison with the late 19th century. You can see some kind of a pause in the late 19th century, and then this upward trend. We have the downward from 89, and then the turn back up in now. Okay, so what are the things, you know, that are a bit striking in the new data set as compared to the old data set? So the first thing, this time, you know, we probably had to wait 5 seconds to get the picture, as opposed to waiting overnight to get the picture the first time around in the 80s with the kind of first generation PC. But so the picture came out, and I was saying, no, this has to be wrong, because I was thinking back to the labor group, and you know, here we have you can see 1919 as a peak, 1946, 47 as a peak, but the overall peak is 1936. And so so my first thought was, oh boy, there must be something wrong with our data, right? And then I said, okay, let's just pull out the labor data. So we pulled out the labor data, and the labor data, frankly, looks like this is the global social protest labor data, right? And it looks very similar to the World Labor Group data, with the peaks in 1919 and 1947 for labor unrest, as opposed to all forms of social unrest. So then I said, okay, so what is producing that 1936, that peak in the mid 30s? And so it turns out that the 1930s peak was being produced by fascist, anti-fascist clashes, in particular, fascist, anti-fascist clashes leading up to the Spanish Civil War. And so then I went, I was like happy that the data then made sense, but then I was distressed because first time we saw this, again, like we've been sitting, not we, because my collaborators would have had this stuff out a long time ago, but like a few years ago, I think it was before Trump, you know, the first time we saw this, right? And I was saying, okay, well, if we're thinking of the early 20th century as somehow being analogous to the period we're heading into, then the idea that, you know, the peak before led to anti-fascist, fascist clashes in which, at least temporarily, the fascists were victorious. That's like a little worrisome, you know. And what we did then is we pulled out this is from our data, right? we pulled, oh, by the way, just pay attention to the blue line here. Don't pay, there, we've got things like, anyway, just pay attention to the blue line. And the blue line shows, this peak of fascist, anti-fascist mobilizations, protests, right, in our data in the mid 30s. And then we see a peak, right? And this peak, I don't know if that's, I'm not quite sure. I'd have to go back and look and see if that's for 11, 12. I'm not sure. That might be 11, or it could be a little bit later. But the point is, again, I guarantee you, and I don't think anyone's going to argue with me about this, when we add the data for to 2020, it's going to be higher, right? It's going to be more up there. So again, this gets back to thinking about what kind of period of world history we're in, and also what are the similarities and differences and contradictions. And I'm definitely not saying, just to be clear, that I'm not at all suggesting that history just repeats itself or anything like that, but there's certain kinds of tensions that are inherent in historical capitalism, right, that produce certain kind of outcomes. And I think that we're in a period, again, this deep crisis of legitimacy without a clear solution that is producing both this kind of right-wing, left-wing mobilizations, and because there's no strong reformist solutions in areas where the solutions are kind of weak or unclear, that it opens space for these kind of right-wing mobilizations. So let's see, 12:30, okay, I'm okay. This is just pulling out the labor data. And and obviously what I'm pointing to is, if you look at global social protest as a whole, we get a peak post 2011. If you look at labor unrest, we're not getting a peak. And so then the question is why? Because we went into the project expecting that there would also be an increase in labor unrest. And the reason we expect an increase in labor unrest, some of it I've referred to already, this idea that where capital goes, conflict follows. So we were expecting, significant increases in labor unrest in what do we want to call them, emerging economies, industrializing newly industrial countries, semi-periphery, whatever, so that was one reason. So this geographic and also the emergence of even new working classes and servant sectors in the core, and that kind of labor unrest, particularly among new immigrant working classes in the core. And the second reason that we were expecting is this thing that I've already referred to, is this deep crisis of legitimacy for capitalism, which I'll return to again in a minute. So on the first question of where capital goes, conflict follows, digging into the data, we are seeing that. So those of you who are familiar with forces of labor know, again, the story ended in the late 90s with the with the wave of labor unrest in South Korea, right? This is this is from our data, right? We're putting an X where there's a significant wave of strikes in the automobile industry. So this is following the automobile industry, and the thesis is that where you get big expansions in the automobile industry, where you get movement of capital in the automobile industry, you should also get in short order new working class formation and new labor movements. And I unfortunately I can't mark it or whatever. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but so we're getting this India, China, Mexico showing up here in our data. This is just auto, but anyway. So you see this kind of move, geographical move over time. More, this was just pulling out the auto industry, but looking at taking our data overall and dividing it by reports of labor unrest in the global north versus the global south, you can see that the percentage of the overall reports we're getting, that the global south is becoming increasingly important in the overall reports of labor unrest, and the proportion of labor unrest reports of events in the global south is now, becomes the majority of reports, whereas it had not been before. Okay, so that seems to be, so then, this is not so important, but then we played around with trying to say, okay, in part it's a problem of, bias in our sources, like, labor movement sneeze, I shouldn't say, but I don't know if labor movement sneezes in France, it's reported, but elsewhere, not necessarily. So we have a core bias in our source. So we just did something that this tries to give equal weight to every country. So at that point, then we do manage to provoke, let's say, I don't think right, a peak here, but so that's one thing but that's still, there's like a sense that there should be, that if we're in the midst of this kind of broader crisis of legitimacy for capitalism, and a lot of that has to do with questions of livelihood, guaranteeing of livelihood and safety, and that should be provoking labor unrest, not necessarily, strikes in factories, but maybe more directed at states, more struggles in the streets as opposed to struggles in the factory. The other thing is not just this growing inequality, crisis of livelihood, but also growing unemployment, surplus population. So, forces of labor was very much organized around this idea of the Marx type labor unrest versus the Polanyi type labor unrest. So the new working classes in formation versus working classes being unmade. But for this project, we've begun to work with this idea of what we call a third type. We don't know what to call it, but the third type is, maybe it's easiest thinking about it as the labor unrest from the stagnant reserve army of labor, unemployed, long-term unemployed, underemployed. And this is just the inequality, this is that, whoop, I don't go back there. And so like, so there's something going on here. Again, this is all from our new data. This is all from our new global social protest data set, right? So this is just taking the non-strike forms of labor unrest. And what's interesting is that, there's it's not a historic peak, but there's, a big peak in the non-strike forms of labor unrest. And so, and again, here's a different way of looking at the same thing. The blue strikes and the red is non-strike forms of unrest. And so the proportion of overall kind of protests and reports that we're getting are, oopsie, what happened there? Okay, are non-strike forms. So the importance of non-strike forms. So, if we're thinking, that one possibility, it's financial expansion versus material expansion, right? So the two periods of financial expansion at the beginning, in the late 19th century, and in the late 20th century, the non-strike forms of protest, meaning, protests in the streets versus protests in the workplace, is, as a shorthand, are becoming predominant. This is
Beverly,
also, yeah,
Beverly, round off in some five minutes, okay?
yeah. I will be, yeah.
Good.
Right. And here's, this is just again, unemployment. Okay, so yeah, so now I'm getting toward the last questions of where we're headed, right? So in the abstract, you know, I hint at this idea that maybe we need to think of the present as a period of crisis of world hegemony, crisis of US hegemony, similar to the period of crisis of world hegemony with the crisis decline of the UK in the first half of the 20th century. And when I say hegemony, I'm using a Gramscian concept of hegemony. So that in the sense that in periods of hegemony, that the ruling groups are able to create some kind of a consensus, to create some kind of a social compact that at least leads social unrest from escalating on a global scale simultaneously. So you might have outbreaks here, outbreaks there, big waves here and there. But if you look at if you look at it globally, it's not it's a fairly flat story, right? And that the question I was raising was whether we're now in a period that's somehow analogous to earlier periods of crisis of hegemony, where it's not just a question, in part, it is a question of the power of leading states declining, but and there's a geopolitical aspect to it, which we need to speak to, which harkens back to the whole world war question, but about the capacity to offer reformist solutions to what are become increasingly revolutionary challenges from below. So if you think of US hegemony as having, or the US, having set up institutions through Bretton Woods, through the Development Project, through other things that, through various kinds of tripartite arrangements that allowed for a reformist solution to the revolutionary challenges of the first half of the 20th century, including what I haven't talked about much is the whole question of decolonization. So the move to universalizing de facto sovereignty. I'm sorry, de jure sovereignty, not de facto sovereignty. De facto sovereignty is another issue. And that these already starting in, in the 90s, but in the 90s, it had mostly a disorganizing impact. That already starting in the 90s, these compacts, these social compacts that had undergird US hegemony begin to break down. And then they become increasingly dysfunctional. So this is again back to this question of this growing crisis, that the old crisis was solved. The old crisis of profitability was been resolved by undermining all these old developmentalist and labor social compacts, and it's leading to this kind of growing wave of social protest on a world scale, and will kind of continue. So the hypothesis is, that unless and until there are locally, globally, some combination of reformist solution to the problems that are now left behind by the period of US hegemony, which includes problems of livelihood, but also ecological problems, because it was very much based on an ecologically unsustainable model, that we are headed into a period of major social protest on a global scale. That would seem probable. So this is just the last slide or two. This is, I don't want to go into this, but this is just a way of referring people to where I'm coming from, is that this is from Chaos and Governance in the Modern World System. And, you know, this kind of Gramscian way of looking at hegemonic transitions, which are, you know, that where, and this is specifically the social conflict one, where, you know, formation, where the question of social blocks, the formation, so when I, you know, earlier I was talking about the making and unmaking of working classes. Now this is like the unmaking and unmaking of social compacts, locally and globally. Okay, I think I'm, okay, maybe I misjudged, but I'm last point that I just wanted to, I'm basically done. Heat, stone, and egg. I was going to make some kind of methodological points with regard to global, you know, how this relates, how one should be thinking about doing global studies, but I think I'll just end here and hear your questions and comments. Okay, thank you. I see some. How do you want to do you want me to call on people or?
Jan, you're muted.
Beverly, thank you very much. Very engaging, very wide-ranging, marvelous. I would like to go to the chat to acknowledge questions. Oh, I see Val. Is that a question, Val?
Yes, yes, it is.
Okay.
Thank you.
Please.
Yeah, Beverly, that was terrific. Thank you very much for that. Your project really sounds, you know, fascinating and very timely. As I was looking at your slides, you know, I saw that dip in protests, labor protests, as well as social protests in the 1990s, that also coincided with the peak of globalization, didn't it? Now, later you said that that was also a period, the 1990s was also a period where the social compact was really being broken. But didn't it take quite a while, Beverly, for the dissatisfaction to really set in? Because then we start seeing a growth in protests about 10 years later, at least, I mean, after 2008. So what's that relationship between the 1990s dip in social and labor protests and globalization's peak? And I also just wanted to ask, just make a quick remark about, you know, your observation that social protests from below really seem to be proliferating. They absolutely do seem to be proliferating. I think we can all recognize that. And I work on the Middle East, and the Middle East is on fire, Beverly. And it's not just social it's also labor protests, by the way, in countries like Morocco and Tunisia in particular, but social protests everywhere. So that's something that is really very interesting, very exciting. And I was also part of you know, this research group and webinar last week on this subject for the Middle East and North Africa. So that's really terrific. Yeah, I mean, if you can also say something about, I guess this is my third point in question, something about any sort of moves towards a remaking of a social pact, because of course Biden is talking about, about that in the American context. But by the way, in the Middle Eastern context, you've got these unions that are insisting on the reinforcement of social rights in a way that you don't hear people in America talk about that, but it's really a very strong discourse in countries like Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia. Thanks.
So Beverly, if you want to combine with one other question, you put them together. So Marcus is next.
Okay.
Thank you. This is fascinating, very rich data set. I noticed that you emphasized very much the geographical relocation of industrial capital. Now, how does digital restructuring fit into this story? Thinking of keywords such as artificial intelligence, such as platform capitalism, how does that shape the new peak?
Yeah.
So Beverly, these two questions, maybe.
Okay. All right. Both very good questions with lots of interesting directions to go in. Let me start with the Biden question. In 2008, after the crisis, I kind of said, okay, this is the crisis that's analogous, right, to 29, and it's going to, and it's obviously going to lead those in power to rethink the direction that inequality has gone too far. That's why I was kind of sort of had in the slide deck the Piketty thing, the U, the Piketty U, and the fact that that particular slide, it ends in 2007, I think, and of course, rather than 2008 marking a turnaround, actually 2008 was just, we hadn't seen anything yet, right? In terms of inequality, not everywhere. I mean, obviously I'm generalizing a bit from US, Europe. I mean, China, there are places that there was some moderation. China's I think a different story. So then I was trying to understand, and this is in this plunges in utter destruction piece, to really try to understand why, because I should say that chart that I was showing you with the pendulum swings between crisis of profitability, crisis of legitimacy, and this idea that the crisis of profitability are resolved by policies and things that bring about a crisis of legitimacy, and the crisis of legitimacy is resolved by things that bring about a crisis of profitability. And so now we're, it seems to me that since 2008, the crisis of legitimacy has been the dominant thing, not the crisis of profitability. And so there, somebody somewhere with some power and intelligence, would be trying to preempt, basically, both, this kind of, so the whole kind of populist responses from below and whatever are in part like this failure to preempt. So the question is why, why this, like, so it's interesting to, so after when the pandemic broke out, the first sign of a switch was from the Financial Times editorial board, right? That they began to publish editorials saying, we need to go back to the kind of social compact that characterized the period, and they were making analogies between the Second World War and the pandemic, and and it was time to switch gears. And yet, we still end up, with like being in this situation of extreme and continuously growing extreme inequality. And so I don't know, whether I think that, we are at an impasse, right? And then the question is, how smooth or unsmooth? So basically, I don't know why I was expecting the elites to be more intelligent than or more forward-looking or long, looking than they have proved to be, right? So, and then there's some question about whether, okay, is it, Polanyi has this interesting line where, he's talking about the industrial bourgeoisie and, back in the Industrial Revolution, that they didn't have an organ to sense the danger, right? So do we have this ruling groups now that don't have some kind of organ to sense the danger, and how bad do things have to get before they sense the the danger. So there's like little signs, in different places, and in fact in China, again, they're different. You point to different places, so there's also a local global question to it. The answer on the delay from below in terms of the protest, that may be part of the issue, is that the delay from below was this kind of simultaneity of the protest and the intensity of protest. Like, it really had to get very intense, and in fact, if you think about the earlier period, it's like, 2 world wars, fascism, and then you get a new social compact. So again, it's more like you feel like, okay, some of this could be preempted, but it doesn't seem to be. I don't know, I can't tell you why, like the simultaneity in 2011, things were popping up. It's not that things aren't always popping up, but the simultaneity. And so and what's very interesting about, and this is a point that I made back in Forces of Labor, is that this simultaneity of global social process, so that there's waves of unrest here and there, that are sort of counterbalancing each other, but that it's happening everywhere all at once. It's very special historical periods, which are, in my formulation, which I didn't get into too much here because I didn't go back into the multiple centuries, but it's these periods of crisis, of hegemony. This, I'll try to answer also the Marxist question in a related way and also quickly, so that people can, but that's the artificial intelligence platform capitalism. I mean, one thing we're trying to understand is, again, whether the problem of shifting directions has something, there are 2 things going on. One is the problem of shifting directions might have to do with this growing reserve army of labor, this growing stagnant reserve army of labor, which is partly related to artificial intelligence. But it's, there's something with, that also you see this, automation also, automation and different forms, increasing the vulnerability of capital and the vulnerability of states, and, in a very different sort of way, the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, shows this kind of vulnerability of logistics, even though it wasn't a labor unrest, as far as we know. I don't think so. I doubt that. Okay. So I think that yeah, in the AI question, I think there are 2 things. One is, what is it doing to power of people? So what is the weakening, strengthening balance of this transformation in the organization of production and automation AI, which I think is not a simple answer. And the other is what's it's doing to the kind of global working class, and because again, it raises an issue of the post-war social compact left out a lot of workers. It only included a small majority of the world's workers. So yeah.
I see Rich, myself, Kim, Hank,
sure.
Charmaine. Rich, over to you.
Beverly, hi.
Good to see you. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. It's great that you can now not have to wait overnight to get your batch back. I wonder, I'd like you to tie this in a little more with crisis hegemony, all of that.
Yeah.
Let me frame it this way. It's sort of the what is to be done question.
Right.
Which I'd like you to address. So I guess the question is, where are we headed now? We're clearly in a period of chaos and restructuring. There's the global capitalism idea of Bill Robinson. There's more Wallersteinian idea, the rise of China as the next hegemonic power. or there's deglobalization. We heard from Walden Bello last week. And, the resurgence of geopolitics as limits of global capitalism are felt. And that, of course, is associated with also the rise of authoritarian governments, which are repressing in China and elsewhere. And we saw that in the United States. So I guess my question is, where do you see, if you put these two things together, these cycles and social protest, and wherever you see we're headed next, one hopeful thought that I have is that if capital returns home and workers don't get much, that will fuel protest. Are the workers of the world ever going to unite, Beverly?
Beverly, I give myself a question before you answer. Maybe you can combine. Beverly, when I think of your data set, the labor trends, they are reasonably clear. Otherwise, when you add protest, unrest more generally, it gets the data become very plural. However, in the narrative, there is a tendency towards, let's call it functionalism, that is certain logics. If the data are plural, should the narrative be plural as well and take into account that we now talk about different kinds of states, different logics of legitimacy and different settings, a wider distribution because of technology and AI, of consciousness and agency, so that reflexivity among all agents worldwide is also diverse. So that instead of just one or two patterns, we should be alert to a wide variety of patterns, and simply the more instrumentalist logics of capital goes, conflict goes, hegemony goes, conflict goes, etc., but multiple ones. We have billions of people worldwide that are conscious and active in various ways. So maybe, Beverly, can you combine Rach's question and then mine?
Okay. So you want, okay. So, yeah, so let me start a little bit with the question of functionalism and how I'm thinking about the relationship between the global and the local, or the between agency and structure, if we want to call it that. So Giovanni Arrighi used to like to quote Mao on contradictions, and his use of this distinction between the heat and the stone and the egg. And so the heat is the systemic contradictions, and and so one thing where I'm starting from is really this idea that there are global systemic contradictions, that there is a totality that is more indifferent than the sum of the parts, and that it has some form of constraining effect on action at the local level, at the national level, and whatever. And so so from that point of view, it's where we see it, of course, most obviously is in this recurrence of crises, right? And the interesting thing about the 2008 crisis is that post 2008, in terms of intellectually in the academy and elsewhere, there's a return of the critique of political economy, that there's an openness to a certain kind of theorizations about capitalism that had been kind of down. That there's a, at least that's what I observe. At the same time, the heat doesn't come out of nowhere. The system is not like something out there. The system is itself a result of human action and agency. And so, and it changes as a result of human action and agency. And so, but there's certain, there's certain moments and periods, and we're in, I think, one of those periods where that the pushes and pulls and efforts from below are having an effect, maybe not the desired effect, but so you can see. So because the source of transformation, systemic transformation, is from agency from below. So this is where, on the one hand, like how this idea of like how one deals with the idea of taking systemic processes seriously without falling into functionalism, where the system is just a steamroller that both flattens everything in its path. And a lot of the globalization literature, talks about globalization as having this steamroller quality that just flattens everything in its path. And so one of the issues of this project is kind of trying to see this interaction between the structure and agency, between the heat and the stones and the eggs. And then in terms of Jan's, I didn't write it down, but the plurality, I guess, that's the stone and the egg, right? So history and geography matter, right? So there are, there is the systemic processes, there's the heat, but that, is Malthus, if you put heat on a egg, you get if it's a chicken egg, you get a chicken. If you put heat on a stone, you just get a hot stone, and so it matters, the history and agency at the local level, which in turn then also in terms of agency affecting the global the systemic processes, it sort of depends where you are, who you are. And so the fact that that there's protests everywhere all over makes it very difficult for a solution without a transformation of the system, right? Because a lot of the solutions, like if you look at the post-war decades, right? Solutions were spatial fix, technical fix, the transformation in the location of production, transformation in the organization of production, and those things, when everywhere is on fire, that kind of thing those solutions aren't there, and that it opens. So this maybe is a segue into Rich's thing that which is both kind of it's an optimistic and a pessimistic, because it's the old chaos and governance question, that we, which were already back in the 90s, we were saying, it was actually 2000, and that was 1999. We're saying, that, all past hegemonic transitions have been characterized by a deep period of systemic crisis with tremendous human suffering, but it's not necessary, that in order to avoid it, this is talking like, 20 years ago, in order to avoid it, the declining power, meaning the United States, has to adjust to a less exalted status in the world, right? Which, like if you think of the last 20 years, it hasn't happened. And if you think of Biden and what he's saying, he's also, the whole out of Afghanistan is part of a pivot to being able to confront China. So the one condition, which was the decline, the West generally, in the US specifically, adjusting to a less exalted status in the world, a more equal world, that it's not clear that's happening anytime soon, and it certainly hasn't happened in the last 20 years. And the other is that new groups or states or coalitions of states or something, or not states, but some kind of new power configuration emerges that can provide a solution to the problems left behind by US hegemony, which are fundamentally ecological problem, right? But also livelihood problem. It's an interconnected livelihood and ecological kinds of problem. And so you can see, again, solutions locally popping up here and there. And then the question is, you get into like, is the Green New Deal feasible is it feasible, but only can accommodate wealthy countries? This return of the North-South divide over the vaccines is like, again, part of this question of what's going to happen. I mean, will you have the whole kind of discussions of ecofascism, whether you can have a solution, but again, it's a solution. It's back to the boundary drawing questions too. Can you have there's a solution, and that's where, like Rich, I'm a little worried about. I mean, it could be fine, return the solution of national capitalist solution or whatever, but that depends on who's included and who's excluded, and so one of the problems with historical capitalism is always not just this legitimacy profitability contradiction, but it's always resolved by some people getting excluded and other people getting included in the compact. Did I answer? War. Yeah, war is a big war. Yeah, I'm worried.
Jan, you're muted.
Kim and Hank, please. Please, if you can be brief because of time.
Okay. I want to take it a little different way. First of all, I was astounded. First of all, thank you, Beverly. But I was astounded that your data showed social protests diving from 1960 to 68 and into 73. You've got to be kidding me. I mean, that just does not make any sense at all. But I want to get to another issue. You're focusing on capital, and one of the labor movements that you did not mention, and is not mentioned by very many people at all, is the Quilombano Uno of the Philippines. This was a country that has not industrialized to any large number, yet is arguably one of the leading, if not the leading, labor movement in the world. And that's not being driven by capitalism and massive amounts of capital going into that. Also, the fact that there were at least 5 dictatorships were overthrown by where labor movements played a key, if not the leading role in overthrowing them in the 1980s and 1990s. I speak specifically the Philippines, Brazil, South Korea, arguably Poland, and then also South Africa. And when you're looking at just capital, that's a whole, those are different processes, and you're totally, I heard nothing about that. So if you'd like to comment on that, I'd like to hear that, please.
Yep. Now?
Hank.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Beverly, for a great and very thought-provoking presentation. I'm going to make an observation and then I have a question, but I cannot, leave out the observation, which relates to the theoretical underpinning of your project and of what you've been presenting. Because it seems you are presenting multiple, and Jan will like this, but I'm a bit more old-fashioned. You seem to be presenting multiple cyclical mechanisms. You in one of your first slides, you have this cycle that is based on Polanyi and the lack of protection or the overprotection of fictitious commodities, leading to particular crises. One type leading to terminal crisis. Then a question which you don't have to answer would be terminal, what is ending then at that point in time, which made me think of the, let's say, the cyclical logic of the theory, the Paris theory of regimes of accumulation. And I would like to ask you to push that forward a little bit, but don't. It also raises the question of the relationship to theories of long waves, Mandel, Kondratiev, etc. Don't answer that question either. The more interesting one that you bring up, the fourth cyclical pattern, is the succession of patterns of financial expansion and contraction, probably on the other side, which I find very interesting, related to cycles of hegemony. And you in what you said this is a Gramscian notion. In what you said, it related mostly to the relationship between states, but then on the slides, we can see that this is also about social forces. So the question that I would like to put to you is, because I didn't hear anything about that either, can you make an attempt, or can you give us some idea of what social forces we are talking about in the current crisis that are steering the process, or that are leading? You say that there is a social bloc. Now, the social bloc isn't always throughout history of the same composition. In periods of financial expansion, the leading social bloc, or the bloc in power, or the historic bloc, has a different composition than in other periods. So can you reflect a little bit on that, and what neoliberalism has got to do with all of this? Thank you. Just if you pick one of them, I'll be happy.
Yeah. So, yeah, should I go? All right. So, yeah, I wish I had lots more time. But I think, yeah, even though you said not to answer it, I do think that the overarching is the systemic cycles of Arrighi systemic cycles, Giovanni Arrighi's systemic cycles of accumulation, which is also embedded in cycles of in hegemony, and that the nod to regulation is that actually, of course, even though the word cycles is there, it's not about just a return. It's actually an evolution. It's an evolutionary theory, not a cyclical theory. And so that's kind of, it's like one of those annoying things where the language leads people, because you're saying cycle. So you think you're saying cycle, you mean cycle, but it's fundamentally an evolutionary theory where there's an evolution from one systemic cycle of accumulation to the next. And the beginning and the reason this has some cyclical aspects was because the beginning and end is this financialization. And that's a segue into say what I would say about the social forces question. Is I do think that and I probably wasn't like explicit enough, or I haven't thought it through enough maybe, but I think that it is labor is the social force, but the problem is that our data is not entirely recognizing that. And I think that has to do with the fact that we're in a period where labor as we knew it is being reformed, and so that a lot of it is either not a lot of these events that are social protest events are fun, and this may be also, I think, nods to an answer to Kim about the kinds of unrest that are fundamentally labor unrest, but they're not, and that's also where I was trying to get, think like where are non-strike forms of this increasing importance of non-strike forms of labor protests, so things that are actually recognized as labor in our data but are non-strike forms, and I think there's a lot of what we're seeing has a labor component to it that's not either being recognized by the newspapers or being recognized by our theories, but it is there. We don't understand. Okay. So I agree with you in this importance of the Brazil, South Africa, South Korea. In fact, those were my initial slides. Of course, the way I talked about them in the initial slides was very, as you point out, capital centric, but they were extremely important. Poland also, I would have stuck Poland, and
Philippines.
Yeah, I know. I know. I need to, but not just the Philippines. I mean, there's, in terms of mass mobilizations that are, fundamentally about questions of livelihood that that somehow get understood as the people, right? Well, who are the people, you know? So I haven't, Kim, I don't think I have time. I actually had stuck in, you know, something about the 1960s. So, you know, in the original World Labor Group database, you know, also 68, you know, doesn't come out as much of anything. And so then I said, well, you know, it's because 68 wasn't primarily labor. And then if you looked in places in the late 60s where there was clearly a strong labor movement, like France or Italy, you know, what that we got major peaks there at the national level. But at the global level, you know, 68 was about something else. Then so I said, but we'll probably get 60s and 68 in particular if we do global, so all forms of social protest. And we didn't get it there either, you know. So besides the 1936, the other thing that was a bit surprising was 68, and I stuck a slide in because at that point, we looked at, we said, okay, let's pull out all of the student and youth protests, and I don't know if I can. Let me. I'm going to do one attempt to share the screen, and if I fail, that's the end of it. Too bad. Okay, so there's 60. This is what Kim is saying about 68. Am I showing you the?
Yes, yes, you
yeah.
show.
Okay, and then so I said, okay, what world? So I said, okay, let's just pull out all of the student youth protest for the entire period. So we pulled out all of the events where students or youth were mentioned as the key actors. And why can't I get this to go down? There. So anyway, this is not a serious answer to your, I can see Kim is very unhappy with my thing here, but I don't know. I mean, it requires a serious discussion. I think the 60s, you know, one thing one of the reasons is that by the late 60s, we're already, you know, if you're thinking about it as on a global scale, we're already at the end of the wave of decolonization and national liberation movements, right? So there's a big kind at the global thing, there's a big wave swamping that. But anyway, but it requires going into more seriously. But yeah.
Please, to Charmaine and Jason, and a question for Brett, please. Brett, given the size of the data and the narrative, can we go over time a bit? Please consider.
Yeah,
yes?
not a problem.
Yeah. Already good. Charmaine, please.
Hi, Beverly. So good to see you, and thank you so much for this brilliant presentation. I have two, I think, linked questions, and I think it builds a bit on what Nick Dyer-Witherford posed in the chat. It's a question about, I would just love you to, if you could tell us more about how you conceptualize social unrest. It seems that social unrest, I think maybe distinct from labor unrest, has more diverse and heterogeneous sources of either ideological contestation or forms of expression, from indigenous land defense to anti-Blackness and police brutality. And so there's a sort of great range there across what you would call global social protest. And I'm wondering if you think that the Standing Reserve Army or the restructuring of labor around the Standing Reserve Army is sort of sufficiently explanatory across a number of these different forms. Particularly when you mentioned the 2019 protests, I was thinking a bit about the ways in which there were over 6 countries that rioted over fuel, food, bread, right, that were over, I guess you could say, social unrest in the sphere of reproduction or the sphere of distribution, and not the sphere of production itself. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I was thinking there is that in the realm of exclusion, as opposed to the realm of exploitation, there are ways in which, and this is sort of probably just my intuition, that the forces of state coercion are more visible in perhaps more directly repressive forms through the mobilization of military-style paramilitary forces with police repression of things like Standing Rock in Chile, etc. So is there a way in which in the current moment, we see the state repression of workplace organizing taking much more implicit or sort of harder to trace neoliberal forms like labor law reform, and then more explicit forms of state coercion in the sphere of reproduction or in the sphere of social unrest? And is that a potential way to think about, I suppose, about the reason for the growth of social unrest as a kind of more visible front? And then the second question is much more kind of practical, but I organize currently with Amazon workers. And one of the things that we have talked about that's incredibly challenging to the restructuring of labor in this moment is the incredible amount of turnover that happens in these logistics warehouses that makes it really hard to organize in the workplace along issue-based lines as we might have been able to in an auto manufacturing plant. And so one of the questions there in a linked sense is, we've speculated about the extent to which identifying how surplus populations understand themselves in relationship to other forms of identity, immigrant identity, refugee identity, what it means to be a Latinx or Black worker, might be ways in which we can think about organizing outside of the workplace and outside of issue-based organizing, and towards forms in which we're mobilizing also around these forms of social protest. Like, what would it look like to think about workplace organizing or the future of labor organizing as something that's linked to the movement for police abolition, for example? And I was just wondering in that second instance, whether you had thoughts about how your work might inform worker organizing strategies in our current era. Thank you.
Jai-san, please. Thank you, Shaman.
Hi, Jan, and
Hi.
thank you. Thank you for giving me this chance. And Beverly, we haven't met, but anyway, thanks for your presentation. I have many questions, but there's only time for one, I think, I'd like to, which is, if you like, partly a methodological question. All of this sophisticated discussion is taking place on the basis of data gained from dominant media, corporate media in the North. First, the New York Times and London Times, then second, New York Times and The Guardian. And it worries me that this worldwide global perspective you want to give is based on these lenses, this very particular ways of looking at the world. And I think my question is, how much do you think your data is in fact filtered and biased by virtue of the sources that you're using? And whether, and today we are in a different age, firstly post decolonization, but post the independence movements in the 50s and 60s, there's a tremendous growth of media across the world. And I wonder whether it would not be wiser to broaden your database to capture a wider range of movements. I really feel, and I'm worried about the dependence on these two sources for all of this theorization. Thanks.
Please, Beverly, and then angry workers, please.
Should I go next? Okay.
Please, yeah.
Let me see if I can tie, yeah. I mean, this is all very important issues that are being raised. So let me I think they both have certain kind of methodological questions that relate to the sources. So let me speak to that and then go from there. So there, yeah. So when we decided on these sources, certainly, back in the original project, there were a few things going on. One is, that we were trying to get sources that existed over a long historical period and that had global reporting capacity, right? And so that we could get, again, there's even with keeping the source constant, there's all sorts of problems about change over time and editorial priorities and this and that. And, and the idea was also to choose papers that were the papers that were centered in the dominant powers, hegemonic powers of the 19th and 20th century. So a UK source and a US source, precisely because of their global concern. Now, there are obviously big problems with this. There's some advantages and there's some big problems, but we try to be aware of what the problems are and then try to, in a sense of saying, okay, what is this actually measuring given what the sources are? And so there are two things that I just, wanted to emphasize. One is that this is not an attempt, maybe the less important in relation to your question, but it's not an attempt to get a census. It's an attempt to get a thermometer of social unrest or labor unrest more specifically. And so when the heat is going up and down globally and also in particular countries, and also to identify kind of major turning point waves of protest or unrest. So this last point about the major turning point waves of social unrest or protest is this idea that it almost there's a kind of built-in threshold to whether one has to be aware of exactly what that threshold is, but I mean qualitatively as well as quantitatively to make it into the international. So that's why we exclude the reports about the United States from the New York Times data collection, and we exclude reports about the UK from the London Times and Guardian recordings. So that's one. So that then has worked. We've done a lot of reliability studies. So this is the other thing that I don't present at all. But we've actually done a lot of reliability studies to try and understand, what taking our country data and looking at it in comparison to what specialists in the country. No, we haven't done Philippines anyway, but the specialists in countries know about what are the key turning points in that country, and for the most part we're good there. The data like that the peaks are what are understood generally as being the peaks, turning point peaks in the data. The other thing, and this may speak most clearly to what you're saying, is that to the extent that it's somehow understood as a relationship between social protest below and kind of elite or transformative global social protest. It's the social protest that is making the hegemonic power, or those who, the main readers of the hegemonic newspapers, making them nervous. So in some ways I would have rather had the Financial Times, but we had a dispute with them. Anyway, we ended up with the Guardian. But in any case, so that's one issue. But I take what you're saying seriously. We have thought about adding. They're definitely, even putting those two papers together. UK and a US paper, they counterbalance each other a little bit in terms of the geographical area biases, but there's still continue to be biases. We had somebody was going to, I think, is Chris still here? He's gone. Was going to do maybe a Japanese newspaper, to get anyway. But it's So and then that brings me to something that Charmaine said, which is kind of interesting, because I think one thing that's going on and why we're getting, and I don't know what the interaction is between the source bias and the actual what's happening in the world, is that because they're, the capacity, the kind of reformist responses are not working, right? And the repression is getting more and more extreme and extensive. And the newspapers have a bias toward reporting violence, and so there's like some kind of interaction thing going on, which we need to think about how to interpret it, what to interpret as because what I like to say is we have biases in our newspaper, but some of the biases are actually good biases. Let me just answer your two substantive things. One is about the food, fuel, and bread, so livelihood. And I think, yes, I mean, if we can understand it as such, we code it as labor unrest, and I think that that's a growing part of what's going on, and it's not necessarily directed at employers. It's often directed at the state, or at states, or at, and the other question was the relationship between status struggles and class struggle, if you want to put it that way, right? So I think one thing, that we're playing with is this idea that a lot of struggles that look like strictly status-based struggles have a labor class component to them. So even like if you think of Black Lives Matter, in terms of anti-police violence, like a lot of the victims are, working class people coming home late at night from work or whatever, are kind of out or in particular neighborhoods where they're vulnerable to. I think if you think about a lot of, feminist struggles, like if you think of Me Too, for example, because I was saying, now lots of people say it, but as soon as the Me Too came, I said, well, this is a labor, movement thing, because it's about being treated with dignity and respect in the workplace. And so, but it certainly does, it has, again, all sorts of forms that it takes, and it's not immediately. So I think disentangling, and then there's the, status struggles that are about trying to hoard opportunities, and and so that also like shapes how all this is happening, which was where my answer to Rich was going in terms of the negative and the good and bad of the struggles, in terms of what kind of solutions are possible. In terms of I want to look and I need to look more closely what's been happening with this like with the loss of the the union vote and things like that. The turnover itself, like if you think back, one thing is that, if you look at the way people talked about auto plants in the 1920s and really into up until 34, 36, right? They were impossible to organize, full of immigrants, all speaking different languages, coming from different backgrounds, that it was noisy, you couldn't talk, people were tired, and the turnover was tremendous until unionization. There was a tremendous amount of turnover. So there's a sense, like a post facto sense of, of Fordism somehow being inherently easier to organize auto plants than. And I think, Amazon being part of logistics, like if you look over our data, I didn't show it today, but that logistics is like the leading sector in logistics, in, warehouses, transportation. It's the leading sector. It's the leading sector in terms of its overall weight in the data. So it's an interesting question to dig down into, because I don't think there's something inherently unorganizable about Amazon. I don't know, of course, the power again, I don't know. Yeah.
Please, Beverly,
yeah.
If you bear with us, Marco, one more question, final question, please.
Right. Yeah. Hey, everyone. Hey, Beverly. I was part of a group in Germany. We translated Forces of Labor into German back then.
Since okay. Wildcat.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Since then, we try to, keep trying to understand what is the global working class today, and even try to understand it on an empirical level is a big challenge, as you know best. Yeah. My question is more like, in this empirical effort, did you come closer to an idea what could be a new kind of understanding of an internal cohesion of that global working class in terms of strategy? if we look back at the last century, there were two main strategies that let's say, the movement created in terms of internationalism. One was in the 1905 to 1920s, uneven and combined development, tried to understand the cohesion, how like an uprising in agricultural Russia could connect through a cohesion of, foreign investment and industrial links with the Western, more developed working class in Western Europe. So that was in internationalism that was not just ideological, but based on the relation between, let's say, Russia being backed by foreign investment. Sorry about that. The second strategy in the 60s was class composition, that tried to understand how certain segments of the class, based on their position, can be a kind of leading subject, and from then kind of organically focus a movement that goes beyond its sectorial boundaries. So we have got these kind of two main, let's say, strategical tools in our box from the last century. Since then, obviously, things have become much more complex. And I read like an article, it's Mike Davis, and he said, if we try to understand working class revolution on this global level, or let's say transformation on that global level, we have to think in terms of Lagos, Shenzhen, and I think he says California, in the sense of representing the concentration of, the industrial productive segment of the working class in Shenzhen, financialized kind of computer, kind of Silicon Valley type of working class in California, and Lagos as an informal, impoverished kind of segment. That I think is a starting point to say like, okay, this is kind of the archetypes of global working class, but that's just a start. The question is, what is the cohesion? What is the inner cohesion between these three poles? So I just wonder if through the empirical work that you did, if you came closer to, an understanding of how, these seemingly very distant parts of the working class, influence each other nowadays. And that's one last example, could be something like Saudi Arabia nowadays, that is on one hand very dependent on internal migration from, let's say, China, from Pakistan, India, at the same time is such a regional hegemonic force, but it's built on very shaky legs. So the whole internal economy is built on this migrant labor, and at the same time they completely influence the regional labor market by their military and whatever interventions. So I just wondered if you came closer to an idea what our the inner strategy of the working class could be there.
Now that, I mean, I'm not gonna, that's I think that's really, the important question that needs to come out of this, or, and it's not gonna, I mean, the empirical will help somewhat, but I think that, the question of, I don't know which section of the manifesto where, Marx and Engels say, the role of the little c communists is to take this bigger view of the, class, long-term global situation of the class as a whole, and so, and I know, I've got another paper actually that, and I think that this is where we're gonna, head here too, is that where the, let me answer it this way, is that where this data can help, supplemented by more local sources and things like that, is that we can think of hegemony as having a supply side and a demand side. Okay, so supply side is whatever agencies can do, the organizational solution, right? The demand side we can see from what are all these movements that are popping up all over the place, and what what are they demand? Sometimes what are they literally demanding? But other times, what are they? Why are people upset? What's upsetting people? You know, and to try and then add that up. Then the problem is it usually adds up into a picture that because even within the global working class, there are people who are situated in stronger states and weaker states and more militarily powerful states, you know, that the solutions can, you know, so the problem of internationalism comes up and the fragility of internationalism. And even when you talk about, you know, 20th century examples, of course, they collapsed, right? So, so what I would say is, you know, when I look at at this, what's popping up all over, you know, it has to do with physical safety. It has to do with dignity and respect. It has to do with livelihood. It has to do, you know, the ecological is embedded in all that. You know, the geopolitics is, you know, which is super important here. You know, is embedded in all of it, both on a problem side and a solution side. So I haven't really, I don't have a compact answer, but the question is important.
Beverly, thank you so much. What a great talk. You've inspired a great discussion. Marvelous thanks to everyone. Beverly, applause.
Thank you for all the great questions and discussion.
Hi, thank you. Brett, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for joining everybody. Next week, we're going to be hosting Wasim Khaled, who's going to be talking about, the title of his talk is When Conspiracy Theories Take Hold. And I think he'll have an interesting talk. He talks about the use of bots and misinformation. So.
All right. Thanks everybody.
Thanks.
Next week.
Good to see you, folks.
Brad, are you saving the chat? Because I couldn't look at the chat during the session, but I see there's lots of interesting things in the chat.
I'll send it to you.
Maybe let me see if I might be able to save it. Let me see.
No, he can send it to you.
Yeah, it auto saves for me.
All right.
Yeah,
all right.
save
good.
it and send it. All right.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.